everybody. Hope you guys had a great weekend, and we are going to get into chapter 13. Just some reminders. We have a quiz on Thursday for chapter 11 and chapter 13, so please watch this video, and there will be three questions at the end you need to answer as like homework credit, okay? That's due Thursday. So let's get into it. So these are your objectives, and my biggest advice for all this is, like you said, go in the textbook, try to answer these objectives the best you can, and you're pretty much in the clear for that. Now, penguins on thin ice. With bits of bone and bites of data, scientists kind of track the birth and loss of the penguin species based off how we adapt to the environment. So well-fed from months of feeding, these emperor penguins in Antarctica kind of headed to the breeding grounds of the burnt ice shelf so that they could mate. And pretty much after they arrived, the female penguin would lay an egg and transfer it to her male partner, who would go and watch it and incubate it while the mother went off to go get food. And it could be up to 3 months they do that. And when she returns, usually both the parents will take equal care of the little fluffy penguin right there as it grows into an adult. In 2016, 17, and 18, the sea of ice broke up months early. And so scientists Peter Fretwell and Philip Trathan observed that the adult penguins were strong enough to swim to land, but the chicks, unfortunately, the babies, were not. And so there was some catastrophic breeding failure that kind of ensued with each year because, again, with the polar ice caps breaking, and so the penguins will have to swim to new habitats and environment. That means only the strongest can swim, and unfortunately their babies could not. So in 2022, NASA scientists pretty much announced that the sea of ice around Antarctica was actually at its lowest levels in 40 years of satellite monitoring, because of global climate change. And so climate change is obviously the altering of the quality and availability of food and their nesting habitats for these penguins because of the fact of them losing their habitats. And they talk about this island in southern Indian Ocean where there's like 500,000 breeding pairs of king penguins. The second largest is the size after the emperor penguins. Lost 90% of its population, unfortunately, ever since the 1980s. So that means the way our climate overall is changing is affecting our environment because they're losing their habitat. And then this just kind of goes over how, because of that, like colonies such as the small Adelie penguins are pretty much declining. So survival and successful reproduction are together referred to as its fitness. Remember, I brought that up last chapter. Your biological fitness is you're able to reproduce and survive in a new environment. So you yourself survive long enough to reproduce and extend on your line. That is biological fitness. And there are some adaptive traits that could affect and improve your reproductive fitness, okay? And it can be structural features or behavioral traits or biochemical, all of that. And it kind of enables the species to not only survive, but thrive and reproduce. That is the fitness. Not enough just to survive, but for you to reproduce. And the example of that are these penguins that have many adaptations to life as aquatic birds. And some of these are like your sharp-hooked beak, torpedo-shaped body for like swimming and undulation, webbed feet for steering and swimming, your feathers for waterproofing, muscles that store oxygen. All of this is for aquatic animals. Now, adaptation, another key term, very important, let's go and underline it so you know how important it is to me, is commonly applied for any traits or processes of evolution through natural selection. You kind of adapt to your environment, which means how the environment affects you changes your overall features. And it can either be advantageous or detrimental, but usually it's advantageous to an individual of a population. And it can be some evolutionary process of natural selection that kind of enables that good match between these population of organisms and its environment. An example is, like when I'm talking about the penguins, their webbed feet, something they adapted to, those webbed feet allow for them to swim better, okay? And then you've got generation time, which is kind of the average age difference between a parent and its offspring, and the amount of time it takes to produce a new generation too, which can also affect your fitness as well. So for humans, it's around 30 years. The average is about 30 years before you produce another offspring. Penguins, it's every 4 to 6 years. And then fruit flies, it's every 10 to 12 days. And then bacteria, unfortunately, like E. coli, is every 20 minutes. So that reproductive turnover rate affects your fitness. Usually species that have a slow generation times, like penguins, may not adapt quickly enough to keep pace with climate change, unfortunately. So what I mean by that is, like we had said, the polar ice caps melting due to climate change. The penguins have to be able to swim to different habitats, and of course their little chicklets, their offspring cannot swim and therefore will die. In order to upregulate their fitness, they need to produce more, but they're reproducing every 4 to 6 years, so their reproductive rate is not catching up with the times of climate change, therefore their fitness is going down, unfortunately. So species are usually a member of a group that can mate with one another to produce fertile offspring. So like human race is a species because we can mate with each other and make offspring together. Where do new species come from? Well, that comes from evolution and adaptations and stuff and how the environment changes. So the biological species concept, another key pearl that I care about. I'm going to care about all this, but I'm underlining stuff for a reason, guys. Is when a group of natural populations can be interbred to produce fertile offspring that can't breed with other such groups. So they are reproductive isolated from other populations. So that's the biological species concept to a T, okay? So the definition of a species is usually frequently discussed when it comes to evolution, because biological species concept doesn't always apply and is usually often impractical to test when in regards to evolution. Many species are not just defined by their ability to interbreed. That's why. So today a lot of scientists identify and distinguish these species using more criteria such as morphology, DNA sequence, ability to interbreed, as well as biogeographic information. All of that combined takes into account for species definitions. And morphology is just kind of the organism's physical characteristics too, as well as, in addition to their DNA. So Teresa Cole, graduate student, used multiple types of data so that she could build an evolutionary tree of both living, which is, that word is extant. Whenever we talk about biology, living is extant, and dead, extinct penguin species. And she kind of gathered nearly complete mitochondrial genomes. Remember mitochondria? We're talking about the organelles. For all species using samples from penguins preserved in museums and samples from live penguins. And from that, added information to the database about what extant and extinct penguins would look like. So speciation, we're talking about species, that's the process where one species splits to form two different species, okay, or more. And it occurs because of some genetic divergence. And genetic divergence is kind of like the totality of differences in DNA sequences of genes in two or more populations over time due to mutations, adaptations, variable reasons, okay? And it results in populations becoming more and more different over time. And then when we're talking about geographic isolation, that's the physical separation between your populations, which is another way new species can form. So for example, like if we were to use as a case study these penguins that have to swim to a different habitat because they're losing theirs, and they become isolated from another species from the same species of penguins. One is in one habitat, one is in another. They'll adapt and develop different character traits over time, and therefore gain different traits from one another, making them more dissimilar due to speciation. And geographic isolation can kind of enhance that, okay? And like I said, due to a new geographic barrier, I'm using the polar ice caps, melting, climate change, river, canyon, mountain chain, volcanic eruption, any type of thing like that, okay? So the Grand Canyon is a big geographic barrier. This is an example I'm using for squirrels. So this shows that the kaibab squirrel is kind of confined to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, whereas the Albert squirrel lives in the south rim. So they're going to have different traits. You see them right here? The northern rim squirrel, which is the kaibab, kind of looks a little darkish in color. And then the Albert squirrel is kind of brownish on the top. And that's because of their location. They've gained different, they have adapted separately from each other, diverging a little bit from their original species. And gene flow is how we pass alleles between populations of different species, okay? So what makes a species? Well, allopatric speciation is that formation of new species from geographically isolated ones. So that's kind of what I'm talking about from speciation. You've got the new species that kind of form from that isolation. And Cole kind of studied that, showing that penguin speciation is driven by this island formation, like I was talking about, them going isolated from their habitats. So these penguins are evolving and adapting separate from other penguins, therefore becoming a new kind of species. So now let's talk about sex, all right? So possible benefits of sex as well as the cost of it. The benefits of sexual reproduction and stuff, obviously genetic reproduction, created many valuable for adaptation to new environments, and it can help a population eliminate detrimental alleles through genetic diversity. So remember last chapter when I talked about, when we increase the genetic diversity, you kind of decrease the occurrences of pathologies, whereas if you're kind of mixing in the same gene pool over and over again, there's going to be an increased rate of pathologies. So benefits of sexual reproduction and all that, and creating a genetic diversity on your gene pool kind of is beneficial to your alleles, okay? And then cost of that, though, parents will only pass 50% of their genetic material to the offspring versus like 100% for asexual reproduction, so you're not going to make a clone of yourself. And while these gene combinations, like I was talking about shuffling to kind of decrease the amount of occurrence of pathologies, it could also do the opposite, as well as like the certain gene combinations a mom had for her were beneficial, and then mixing with her partner brought upon more detrimental ones, okay? So that's just some pros and cons. Brand new species, coevolution. I think working together. So coevolution is when two species rely on each other to not just survive, but thrive and evolve. So this is an example right here, where you've got the flowers co-evolve with the hummingbirds because they produce nectar and it's colored to attract the birds and shaped so that to fit the hummingbird's bills. So they kind of co-evolve together, because the flowers kind of need the hummingbird needs the nectar from the flower. So they kind of evolved where the hummingbird's bill fits perfectly into the flower because the flower evolved those certain type of leaves for it. Now, Charles Darwin, he's kind of the father of natural selection. He visited the Galapagos Islands and observed finches from various islands and realized that they were all related but had distinct phenotypical, remember last unit, phenotype, observable differences. So the Voyage of the Beagle, big one, is where Darwin kind of wrote that this kind of gradation of diversity in one small kind of related groups of birds kind of fancy that from original ones. And so he was pretty much kind of confirming that they kind of evolved from a common ancestor, just diverged by certain type of traits. And then more recently at the Galapagos, you've got Rosemary and Peter Grant, those scientists that observed the development of new finch species in just 2 generations. So kind of the evolution of adaptations, this process of speciation can occur slowly or rapidly. And that has to do with genetic differences, whether it's occurring slowly or rapidly, environmental, theorizing that global climate change can affect this rapid change as well too. And then ecological isolation, that's the idea that 2 closely related species are reproductively isolated by minor differences in their habitat. When I say reproductively isolated, they're not going to intermingle with each other. That has to do with small differences from their habitat. And the example of that is these penguin researchers that proposed that one penguin population preferred the warmer ocean currents and food, whereas the other one wanted colder currents and food sources. So that affected the reproduction. And this is just a little debunked myth. Now, sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is kind of that formation of a new species in the absence of a geographical isolation. So remember I was talking about how, due to habitat reasons, so this type of speciation is common in plants as well as the ocean and other large bodies of water, okay? And then a reproductive barrier exists usually between 2 species that kind of are blocked from reproducing with each other. And that's kind of divided into 2 subcategories. We've got prezygotic and postzygotic. Remember zygote from meiosis? So prezygotic barriers are preventing a male gamete and female gamete from fusing. So that acts before the zygote exists. Remember those gametes from meiosis, the sperm and the egg? Prezygotic barriers prevent the sperm and egg from making a zygote. And then postzygotic prevent them afterwards. So an example of post-zygotic, they talk about the donkey. So they make the horse and the donkey make a mule, but a mule cannot reproduce with another mule to make another offspring. So that's that post-zygotic barrier, okay? And reproductive barriers of that, here's some examples for pre-zygotic examples: ecological isolation, behavioral, mechanical, gametic isolation. And then post-zygotic, those are like the zygote death, the baby just dies. Hybrid sterility, that's what I'm talking about with the mule that's produced, because those mules are sterile. And then hybrid performance, they survive poorly, so they reproduce poorly. Polyploidy, when we're talking about chromosomes, a polyploidy is a condition where there is an individual that gains an extra full set, like 2 to 3 extra chromosomes. And that can result in a new species formed, very common in plants as well as some animals, and can also be fatal in people depending on certain polyploidy pathologies. So this is an example of haploid to diploid, to triploid, to tetraploid. And then when we're talking about the future, you know, I'm bringing up global climate change again because despite catastrophic loss of the emperor penguin chicks, the smaller Dawson lambda colony has grown more than tenfold over the past 3 years. And these researchers speculate that many of the emperor penguins may have relocated there and adapted. So we're going to be moving to safer breeding grounds. Is that going to be enough, I guess, to save the emperor penguins? The future of climate change, they say, Professor Cole says, is predicted to cause a species-wide extinction of some penguins, and that could be either dying off or those penguins adapt to become a new species because of their environment. So from these living penguin species, 5 are in danger of extinction, 5 are vulnerable, and 3 are threatened due to global climate change. So if we don't protect them now, there won't be any. Now, this was a very quick chapter, but what I need from you guys is to answer question 1 and 2. 3 is kind of cut off, so I'm not going to ask that. But question 1, when we're talking about this, it says, explain in your own words why this is an example of post-zygotic barrier that maintains in species. So I kind of went over it, how this is post-zygotic. And then occasionally, a female mule will give birth, but her offspring are invariably infertile. Is this an example of pre- or post-zygotic barrier? So I want you to answer these 2 questions. I will put up a discussion board comment, and you're just going to get, that'll give you 100% for attendance. So watch this, answer that, and you'll be good, guys. As always, if you need anything, I am just 1 click away, 1 email away, and stay curious, guys.